Welcome to Beyond the Box, the podcast where we unpack the future of global logistics. I'm Cecilia Larson, and I'm pleased to be joined by my co host, Philip Lewin. In today's episode, we're diving into the increasingly frequent and urgent challenge facing supply chains, climate change, and the severe weather risks that come with it.
Thanks, Cecilia. And to help us unpack this, we're joined today by two leading experts in business resilience and risk management to explore how logistics providers and the industry as a whole can help deal with more disruptions from volatile weather. For example, the more severe storms that are forecasted this year along some of the world's key shipping lanes and ports. Let's get into it. So, first, I'd like to welcome Andrew Forsyth, Head of Climate Resilience and Sustainability based in the United Kingdom. Andrew works at Zurich Resilient Solutions and is focused on helping organizations identify and manage their climate risk in order to build resilience in their supply chains. Welcome, Andrew.
Hi both, great to be here.
We're also pleased to welcome our colleague from Maersk Insurance, Peter Gill. Peter is a loss prevention manager in our Global Risk Management Division and works on risk engineering and climate change. Welcome, Andrew and Peter.
Thank you so much.
So, I'm just going to jump right in because I'm sure everyone's eager to hear from you guys. I'd love to know, how is climate change and severe weather reshaping the risk landscape for global supply chains?
I think the key thing when we talk about integrated logistics and supply chains is, unfortunately, climate change doesn't respect boundaries. It doesn't respect geographical boundaries, doesn't respect organizational boundaries. And that's the key challenge here, is that when we talk about our own business, for instance, I think that's the inherently complex thing with climate change. It's difficult to understand whose responsibility is it to manage that flood risk or that emerging heat risk. So it's a perfect topic to talk about today in terms of how we can get our heads around what information, what data, and what tools we can help to get ahead of that. And in my view, to move from where we're currently at across the board, which is a very reactive view to all this, and moving to being proactive about how we manage our climate risk.
Peter, do you agree? Do we need to see companies moving to a more proactive way of reacting? And overall, how do you see the landscape changing?
Well, I very much echo what Andrew just said. From our perspective in the logistic business, we see an increasing frequency of events like storms and wildfires and floods, for that instance, and it means that we have a higher volatility. We need more frequent rerouting, and there's a growing need for visibility and resilience to maintain the reliability and efficiency towards our customers.
And, I know last year we had record flooding, but also record droughts, also severe storms during typhoon and hurricane season. Which regions are especially vulnerable to these kind of weather disruptions? And how are logistics providers adapting to some of them?
But I think we're increasingly seeing, as we live this experience, just as individuals, let alone within our work context, is unfortunately the past is becoming a less accurate predictor of what's coming in the future. And I think when we're talking about what regions are currently most vulnerable to different risks and what those risks are, we're starting to get a tipping point, really, in terms of there's a lot of known knowns. So a lot of countries will know what their key risks are. Is it flood? Is it extreme heat? Is it, are they in a tornado paths, or hurricanes? Now, what I think we're moving towards is the sort of the new and emerging hazards in countries and regions that haven't experienced those hazards before, or at least maybe aren't built or resilient in a way for those. I think that's what we're seeing in terms of as a changing global pattern. And unfortunately, the sort of building stock or the warehousing and the transport infrastructure can't be as nimble as just switching. It is what it's going to be. We can't just build lots of new things to respond. So it's how we look at that and increase resilience of our existing infrastructure.
But if we see from our perspective in Maersk, the most vulnerable regions today are the U.S. Gulf Coast is hurricane, but also in the Southeast Asia, we have typhoons and flooding over there, and in Southern Europe, where we see heat waves and catastrophic floods. In 2024 alone, we had roughly 220 extreme weather events that were impacting our logistics operation. And that was especially in the US and in Spain. So in order for us to take that seriously, we, as Andrew said, we need to go away from being reactive and to be proactive. And in order for us to do that, we need an agile approach. And that is key to maintaining the resilience. We need to break down silos and really work together with our customers and partners as well.
And I think one of the key things that you're both coming back to is kind of how do we adapt to this? How do we make something work in a new way? And one of the areas that we know that a lot of companies, especially within the logistics field, that people are beginning to explore is tech. So how can companies leverage things like data analytics, AI, or even satellite technology to predict and mitigate weather-related disruptions? And in that vein, are there any emerging technologies that you're excited to see in that space?
Well, in Maersk, we're using advanced data analytics to better predict and mitigate weather-related disruptions. We, for example, have some real-time weather data integrated into our routing systems to anticipate delays and reroute cargo. And then we do that dynamically. But a key tool in my arsenal is a platform that helps us to assess both the current and the future and climate risk across all our land-based locations. And this layered data-driven approach helps us to take faster decisions and smarter planning and more resilient logistics setup.
So I think there's sometimes there a balance in terms of it. Peter saying exactly the right things, which addresses my earlier point, which is, having those models, looking at different climate scenarios and time horizons is absolutely where you should be starting around this. When we talk about climate change or physical climate risk, get something which is showing you, where the hazards are increasing or decreasing, what the trends are, so you can understand where your assets are and, what to do. Moving into that deeper analysis in terms of that data, one thing I probably say on a weekly, maybe daily basis, my team are probably sick of me saying, is people often conflate climate hazard ratings and scores with climate risk. Actually, really understanding your risk isn't just about I'm exposed to flood or I'm exposed to heat in this particular location or this particular asset. Not all assets, or in this context, suppliers or ports are equal. There's a real sense of, well, okay, the hazard level is, what are we talking about here? Are there lots of people there? Are there lots of machinery there? Is it somewhere where there's lots of transient goods going in and out of? What's the criticality there in terms of, is it the machinery operating to a certain efficiency? Is it people operating to a certain efficiency? And then you start to look at the hazards and say, this is actually giving us some questions, in terms of, can machinery operate in prolonged periods of 40-degree heat? Can our people operate in prolonged periods of 40-degree heat? So you're moving beyond some of the, say, property or building type impacts and saying, operationally, and I think about integrated logistics, what does this mean? And what's critical? Who's critical? And where are they? So you start to join these dots. And
because the most important thing for us is how we predict and respond to the disruptions. We are in the market seeing some promising partnerships, for example, between Africa and the EU, where they are trying to have a space-based climate monitoring system that will help us getting better warning systems. And for us, that is key, to have early warning systems that can help us taking the right decisions at the right time. If we take another aspect of it, in logistics, we're seeing a very high trend of the IoT as an Internet of Things, where we can monitor everything everywhere. And we can track it. We can use it for visibility towards the customer. We are the supply chain of many of our customers. And that gives us a possibility of having this agility that we need and it also helps us being more proactive.
Looking a little further, every year has its own weather incidents. I think we're in a El Nino year with a lot of storms predicted. But beyond that, on the horizon, what do you see as some of the key industry trends coming in terms of supply chain resilience? I think technology, of course, is, as you both spoken about, is a big one. What other trends do you think are going to emerge as key in the coming years?
Well, if I can start here, we from a global perspective, in the next 5 or 10 years, we are looking into increasing unpredictability and also intensity of the extreme weather events, especially in critical areas like ports, canals, major trade corridors. And it's floods, mainly floods, wildfires, but also, as Andrew mentioned, heat waves that shut down the infrastructure and delay shipments. But what makes this risk so challenging is compounding nature. It's not just one storm, it is a series of disruptions. And that's why I think resilience and agility, as we talked a lot about, and the real-time visibility will be the defining capabilities.
So I think the key thing for me, I'd agree with Peter, is the cumulative impact of events. I'd also say, when we talk about integrated logistics and supply chains, it could well be that within a supply chain or even with a product journey, depending on the length of time, there could be multiple different events happening at different points in that journey. Yet there could well be a drought in one area and flooding in another globally, in terms of the journey of that product, in terms of that sort of global picture. So I think part of that as well is this is sometimes thought about, say, well, what happens if, one part of your supply chain is impacted by, floods in a certain region? Okay, well, actually we can, business continuity wise, we can figure out an alternative. But I guess the complexity comes when, there's floods somewhere, there's a hurricane somewhere, there's a storm somewhere else, there's a heat wave somewhere else, and this is all impacting on the same supply chain. And in terms of the ability, I guess, and the responsiveness of the people involved in that as well. So I think some of that is, sometimes you can have the data, the information, you may even have the physical defenses, resilient measures built into your assets. But actually, do people also know what their role within that is? I'll tell a story to illustrate that, for instance. So we work with one company and they said, well, in the event of a flood, we have a response plan. So we know what we're going to do. We said, let's stress test that with you. Let's understand what it looks like. So, well, what we do is we go to our handbook. So where's your handbook? So it's in that cupboard there in that site. So into the handbook, they flicked to the page that said, what to do in the event of a flood. That said to call head office. So we said, well, let's call head office. Let's test this. They call head office and say, we're doing this exercise. We just had a flood. What do we do? They said, great. Well, we'll look in our handbook. So that took a few minutes for them to find their handbook. So it's all still printed out on paper. They found their handbook, flipped to the right page, and it said, our handbook says to look in your handbook, which you just figured out said call head office. So you've got this circular notion of, on paper, they had this, a way of responding to a flood, but in reality, they'll be running around like headless chickens because no one knows what to do, who to call, how to deploy the relevant flood defenses, and all these things. So I think some of that is, bringing people along with this and involving the right people in this. This is not just an insurance thing, for Peter and his team to do. This is not just an operations thing. This is not just a sustainability or climate related team thing. This is a organizational resilience to, extreme weather events, which, depending on the semantics, you can sometimes get lost. And if it's about risk, then it's always Peter's job. Or if it's about climate or a sustainability team's job, and actually it's trying to bring those relevant people together to say, how do you then become resilient as a business?
Maersk recently launched a resilience webinar with FT Longitude, wherein research showed that those that were prepared for changes and had resilience as a key part of their supply chain, they lost only 1% of their annual revenue, whereas those that weren't prepared lost about 4 to 5 times that. keeping that in mind, what you would say that companies need to think about when it comes to severe weather risks and harnessing the abilities of their supply chains to work against it?
I think, as I said, getting that data and information to build your business case, because I think in the world that I sit in, speaking to a lot of climate change and sustainability people, there's still a big push on mitigation, which is you're obviously trying to slow down the effects of climate change, but the adaptation messaging and business case needs to be made in terms of this. So get together and understand what your cost of your risk is. So what is the cost of doing nothing? Because that's going to be an important number, and on its own to be quite a scary number potentially, but actually also understanding the other side of that business case, which is the cost of taking action. So increasing resilience, practically, having adaptation measures in place. Now that number will probably be smaller than the cost of not doing some number, and it helped build that business case.
If I can add to that, back to the stress test and the scenario planning, it gives you a perspective of where you need to invest in your infrastructure, where you need to upgrade and activate your contingency plans. But for us, it's not about predicting a future, but it's about being ready for many different futures, because it's also uncertain. And we need to not just lock ourselves up to this type of future. You need to be able to see it from many angles, and you need to be embedded in your strategy, in your top management need to back it up. You need to break down the silos and be part of strategy. It's very important for the future of our operations and our customers.
Well, thanks everyone from tuning in, and a special thanks to Andrew and Peter for sharing the really interesting insights. And I think it'll be interesting to look back at the end of the year. We know there's difficult weather ahead, and how resilient global shipping was, and how supply chains were able to respond.
And as a reminder to all of our listeners, whether you're finding us on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple, please be sure to subscribe so you can follow the ongoing discussions we're having around the importance of resilience in the global supply chain in uncertain times and in certain times. So from here, we say thank you.